On Saturday, protesters lined the Queen Ka'ahumanu Highway outside the Waikoloa Resort, where delegates were reported to be behind closed doors, negotiating the terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Inside the resort by the King's Trail, demonstrators handed out information leaflets and held signs opposing the TPP. Many of the passers-by had no idea what the TPP is, nor why it might be of concern. For this reason, Jim Albertini of the Malu'aina Center for Nonviolent Education and Action helped organize 2 informational forums in the days prior to the protest.
But when the bankers and the corporations get together, it's trouble.
In Hilo, assembled speakers included Juliet Begley with the Americans for Democratic Action.
Understand that TPP is the embodiment of what happens when government and corporate interests collude. We lose.
And from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Dr. Jane Kelsey.
We call it the TPPA because it's not a partnership. It's an agreement. And we refuse to use the con words, just as we refuse to describe it as a trade agreement. It's not a trade agreement. It's a commercial agreement that is designed by and for the interests of big business.
Kelsey is a professor of law and an outspoken critic of both the Trans-Pacific Partnership and globalization. New Zealand is a party to the TPP talks.
We know that when they talk about this agreement, as they do, as being an agreement for the 21st century, it is the 21st century of the 1%. It is not our 21st century.
With commentaries by people like David Korten, I do pay attention, and on March 9th, this is what Mr. Korten had to say about the TPP. The TPP is presented as an agreement to increase U.S. exports and jobs, but what's really at stake is democracy, and in the U.S., as well as in 11 other Pacific Rim countries that are parties to the TPP. Given past agreements in which the TPP is modeled, including NAFTA, the TPP provisions will likely have significant implications for nearly every aspect of American life, including intellectual property rights, labor and environmental protections, consumer safety and product labeling, government procurement, and national resource management. Given the way these agreements are crafted, we can be quite certain that the implications will favor corporate profits over human well-being. And once the agreement is approved, its provisions will trump national and local laws, including the U.S. Constitution, and will not be subject to review or revision by any national legislative nor judicial body, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, those are really sobering words to me.
These may seem like distant concerns.
Good afternoon, everybody. Aloha.
But the TPP has been linked to Hawaii from the beginning.
Thanking the people of Hawaii for their extraordinary hospitality.
In November 2011, the national spotlight fell on the Trans-Pacific Partnership during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Honolulu.
The United States is and always will be a Pacific nation. Many of our top trading partners are in this region. This is where we sell most of our exports.
President Barack Obama spoke to the press before an Oahu sunset.
I'd note that we also made a lot of progress increasing trade on the sidelines of APEC. As I announced yesterday, the United States and our 8 partners reached the broad outlines of an agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And it was to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement where the interests of U.S. corporations and the rules designed by and for those corporations would become the prevailing ethos throughout the Asia-Pacific region, not only amongst the existing parties to the agreement, but by other countries docking on.
And today I'm pleased that Japan, Canada, and Mexico have now expressed an interest in this effort.
It was the means of neutralizing the ascendancy of China in the region.
We welcome the peaceful rise of China.
And it was what we called a kind of Cold War by proxy of commercial agreements.
There are a range of things that they have done that disadvantage not just the United States, but a whole host of their trading partners and countries in the region. The most famous example is the issue of most economists estimate that the RMB is devalued by 20 to 25%. That means our exports to China are that much more expensive, and their imports into the United States are that much cheaper. Now, there's been slight improvement over the last year, partly because of U.S. pressure, but it hasn't been enough.
The agreement had already been under formal negotiation since March 2010. That means now 5 years since that first round of negotiations. They currently have 12 countries involved in these talks.
However, the substance of the negotiations has been kept secret.
When they started the negotiations in May 2010, after Obama had thought about whether he wanted to continue with what Baby Bush had already committed the US to, they made a secrecy agreement amongst themselves. They said no documents relating to these agreements, whether they are emails, whether they are where the meetings are being held, whether they are papers that have been tabled or the draft texts, will be released until 4 years after the agreement has come into force, or 4 years after they have suspended the negotiations. So all you will get to see is the final agreed text, not any of the background papers during the negotiations, and not any of the background papers for 4 years afterwards, which is when those who did it still have power.
That's not really a very open society we're living in. That's the really sobering aspect of the whole secrecy component. TPP is a vehicle to undermine the government as we know it today, with the beneficiaries being corporations over people.
Now, this is a real worry because any deal negotiated in secret is problematic. And the reason for secrecy is that they know if it is subjected to the disinfectant of daylight, it will not survive.
Concerns were fueled when draft documents from the negotiations were leaked.
The leaks have been coming out. We've had about 5 leaks of the intellectual property text, a number of leaks of specific additional ones on medicines. We've had the investment chapter leaked. We've had the environment chapter leaked. And we've had a chapter on regulatory coherence leaked. And all of those give us enough to know that this is a deal that should not be being negotiated.
Opponents say the leaks are a red flag.
The chapter that they released, that the WikiLeaks released, that I thought was most insightful was the longest section of this particular 95-page document, which was, again, in November of 2013 released. The longest one was called Enforcement, the chapter. It was called Enforcement. It's devoted to detailing new policing measures with far-reaching implications for individual rights, civil liberties, publishing, internet service providers, and internet privacy, as well as for the creative, intellectual, biological, environmental commons. Particular measures proposed include supranational litigation tribunals to which sovereign national courts are expected to defer. Sovereign national courts are expected to defer. That's huge. But which have no human rights safeguards whatsoever. The TPP chapter states that these courts can conduct hearings with secret evidence, and they also replicates many of the surveillance and enforcement provisions from the shelved SOPA and ACTA treaties. So that's why ADA is interested in this.
We are told quite often not only that Americans completely support agreements like NAFTA, and this is NAFTA on super steroids, but that it is being pushed by a range of American interests, not simply the corporate lobbyists of the banks and Hollywood and the mining companies, but it is also being pushed by the unions and the environmentalists and so on. Now, what we know from looking at these texts is that that actually is not the case. And we know that from working with a number of those working for social justice within the US.
In fact, a variety of different organizations are coming out in opposition, like the AFL-CIO.
They want to tell you that globalization and tariffs and market share are so complicated, you can't understand it. I understand it. Let me tell you, here's what it means. It means lost jobs and lower wages. That's it. Lost jobs and lower wages. That's it. That's it.
Initial news reports on the TPP showed favorable reaction. Al Jazeera Network did a piece on the potential economic benefit for Kona coffee growers, who are looking to expand into Asian markets.
It could be greater than what all of America could, or the United States could consume. We like the Asian markets. We don't want to leave our brothers behind on the mainland, but their culture is they're willing to pay more for a good product than the average American citizen.
But now that the substance of the deal is becoming better understood, a new list of negative impacts is being proffered by critics.
I know in the US you have a major issue about jobs and offshoring. And the more that the internet and what is called e-commerce has expanded, the more those threats have intensified. There is a chapter in the agreement called the e-commerce chapter, which will aim to have rules that say, if there is a company that is doing stuff by the internet, you can't require it to have a local presence in your country. If it relies on moving data across the borders, whether that's information about you and your debts or your health or your insurance, they can't be required to hold that information inside your country. Which means privacy law. I know you've got not many privacy laws, but if you want to tighten up your privacy laws in the state, for example, your ability to demand that that information is held here and subject to those tighter laws rather than somewhere else that doesn't have those laws, you'll have problems. If you want to be able to insist that data isn't held in places where the state has surveillance powers over all your information, you also have problems. The global financial crisis exposed how big banks and insurance companies operate and how those speculative flows flow around the world with an industry that claims it's too big to fail. That is too big to be regulated. Well, rather than going and working out how to re-regulate, it is going to lock in and extend that light-handed, risk-tolerant lack of regulation of the finance industry in the TPPA, in TTIP, and in TISA. So we need to be really worried about how that instability that we saw before is going to play out in the multiple new crises, which leads to the third of the issues I wanted to refer to, and which is what Juliet was talking about, with the special rights of foreign investors in this agreement. Now, some of you who are familiar with NAFTA will know that already in NAFTA, foreign investors from those three countries, US, Canada, and Mexico, have special rights not available to local firms. And they have a couple of particular rights, not only about their right to invest, but special investor protections. If governments change the laws or the regulations in ways that impact negatively on the profits, including future profits, or the value of that investment, and they think that that is unfair to them, in particular if it changed the rules after they made the investment, they can seek multi-million and in some cases billions of dollars damages for their losses. And ironically, this is called fair and equitable treatment. And the cases are brought not in our domestic courts, but in these secretive offshore tribunals, in which the judges are not proper judges. They are predominantly people who are lawyers representing investors one week, judges in these cases the next week, and back representing investors the week after. There are no effective conflict of interest rules. There is no system of law that applies. They make up the law for each of their cases. It's not like our system of precedent where courts are bound by previous decisions. There is no appeal. They take place largely in secret. They are making outrageous awards, and the number of disputes since 2000 has increased like this. We now have law firms chasing these cases. We have private equity and hedge funds basically leasing the cases, running them, taking the profits as if they were a financial commodity. They are out of control. There is massive global controversy about this.
There was an article by The Guardian's Dan Gilmore, and there's just a couple of pieces where he had comments that I thought were really kind of interesting too, where Gilmore says, the medical industry has a stake in this outcome too, with credible critics saying it would raise drug prices and, according to another analysis, give surgeons patent protection for their procedures. So, there's a group of people that need to make more money.
These are the concerns that mobilized over 60 people to sine wave outside the Waikoloa Resort this weekend.
Well, we first went on the shoreline trail out at the Waikoloa Hilton with our signs, and we didn't have any problem.
According to Albertini, the demonstrators had to fight for their right to demonstrate during the week-long meeting.
And we were met by security that said, nah, this is private road, private parking lot, it's a private beach. Yes, the shoreline is public, but he wanted us to protest. He said, you have to be 4 feet in the water from the low tide mark. So anybody who's short by high tide would be holding their signs, they have to use snorkel. So we stood firm and said, no. As I understand the definition of the shoreline, it's the high wash of the high seasonal surf. That's the definition. And of course, we all know the high seasonal surf has been very high this year, right? It's been into the pond at Anaiho'omalu, and it's getting higher all around the world. So anyway, we stood firm, and then we went to the King's Trail. And the King's Trail was interesting. We had our signs there on both sides, and we were there around noon to 1 at the trail, and there were people from the TPP with their badges around their neck walking by. We saw delegations from Chile, from Vietnam, from Australia, from Japan, and America, and I think probably a few others. But we gave leaflets out, the leaflet we have here, but we saw some of the delegates trying to quickly take off their badge and hide them in their pocket. I think they had sense of shame of what's going on. So.
And despite the secrecy of the negotiations, a dedicated few, like Dr. Kelsey, have been able to keep tabs on the current status of the talks.
After 5 years, almost all of the technical work in the 29 chapters, it's that big, are concluded. Except for the really controversial political decisions. But the ministers from the different countries are not prepared to make those political decisions until the one old-fashioned trade issue of market access is resolved. The US and Japan are talking about how much agriculture products the US can get into Japan, and about Japan lowering its environmental standards for gas-guzzling US vehicles. And Japan is demanding more access for some of its vehicle exports into the US. And they are at stalemate, and they have been for a while. They had a ministerial meeting that was supposed to take place this week. That's why it's a fancy resort. But it's got deferred until April, and we think it might even be deferred until May. but they have a deadline.
Now more than ever, the United States is poised to take the lead in the 21st century global economy.
The Obama administration is continuing to push for the deal. This video was produced by the White House a few weeks ago.
Today, American businesses are selling more goods and services abroad than ever before. That's not just good for business, it's great for American workers. Every $1 billion in American exports supports an average of more than 5,000 jobs here at home. Jobs that can pay up to 18% more than jobs in industries that don't export American goods. Only 5% of the world's consumers live in the United States. 95% are outside our borders. In a time where the world is looking to trade more, we can't afford to stand idly by. The President's plan will unlock opportunity for American small businesses, farms, and families by making sure trade is done the right way. President Obama laid out exactly what that means in his State of the Union address.
21st century businesses, including small businesses, need to sell more American products overseas. Today, our businesses export more than ever, and exporters tend to pay their workers higher wages. But as we speak, China wants to write the rules for the world's fastest growing region. That would put our workers and our businesses at a disadvantage. Why would we let that happen? We should write those rules. We should level the playing field. That's why I'm asking both parties to give me trade promotion authority to protect American workers with strong new trade deals from Asia to Europe that aren't just free, but are also fair. It's the right thing to do.
The President is working with Congress on the most progressive trade agreement the world has ever seen. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it would level the playing field for American workers by using the power of trade to raise the bar for labor and environmental protections across the Asia-Pacific region. It's time for Democrats and Republicans to come together and make that a reality for the American people.
If Obama is going to have this agreement as part of his legacy, he needs to have an agreement by the beginning of June. So we view our current task as making sure there is no agreement by June, not only by hoping that the two elephants can't reach agreement, but by putting enough pressure on our domestic governments to say that they cannot do this. Our friends in Washington are fighting a grand battle to stop fast track, to make sure that other governments are not going to be prepared to sign up to a deal that the US Congress, with all the lobbying interests, can pull apart.
I just want to say that ADA encourages the right to Hirono and Schatz, our senators, and state that we do not want the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement.
During a recent visit to Hilo, Hawaii Democratic United States Senator Brian Schatz was asked about his position on the TPP fast-tracking.
Do you support total transparency and therefore oppose any so-called fast-track process by Congress and have a full open debate on this question?
I generally think trade agreements have great potential, but the way that TPP in particular and TPA, this is the Asia trade agreement that's being proposed, is being negotiated is literally in secret. And remember that any trade agreement that the Senate ratifies supersedes, outranks our federal, state, and county laws. So if we have laws that protect our environment or protect the public health with respect to tobacco prevention or consumer issues or lead in products or plastics or whatever it may be, all of the laws that your Congress has made over decades, if there's any conflict between the law and the trade agreement wins. Okay, so this is not a trivial matter. And what I have communicated to the White House, and I'm usually with them, but not every time, is that that's not going to work for me. That I don't know what's in this agreement, so it's very difficult for me to imagine voting for a process that basically abrogates any authority I may have as a senator to make policy. So I continue to be opposed to fast track.
Mahalo.
Leonard Woods and then Corey.
Aside from congressional pressure, Kelsey said it's up to the people to voice their opposition.
And so we need you in Honolulu, and you in this island, to be adding your voice to that. And it's great that you're going to have such a visible presence on the weekend, because there actually are some negotiators who aren't too keen on this either. and it not only sends a message to your government and to our governments, but it also sends some kind of moral support, paradoxically, to them to stay strong.
Saturday's protest at the Waikoloa Resort was carried out without incident.